Hey there, welcome back to Saucemancy. Today I'm going to be discussing the justification and the importance of balancing games. I know balance can sort of come across as like an icky or a bad word. I think a lot of people equate it with removing power from players, or if you're playing like a player versus player game of one archetype just being way better than all the others, and so it just makes everybody else either play that archetype or not even want to play the game. By the end of this episode, I'm hoping you'll see balance a lot more holistically and not necessarily as an inherently bad thing, but something rather that's necessary to game design. So these little things at the top are mostly to remind myself. Don't worry too much about reading them because I'm going to be going through things item by item. So let's start off with what is balance. I already have written on the board here, balance is the management of outlying variables and mechanics. If you weren't here for the prior episode, a variable is just a value in a game that can change. If something deals 10 damage, you could change it to 5 or 15. Mechanics are variables that are interlinked. Like, for example, if an attack does 10 damage, but it's a magical attack, those two variables are interlinked for the sake of that attack. They can't be separated from one another. So when I say outlying, what do I mean there? I mean, let's say that you have a bunch of swords in your game. Let's say you got 4 swords. And one deals 70 damage, one deals 80 damage, one deals 90 damage, and the other one deals 1,000. Well, so that's quite an outlier. The other 3 are pretty close in power to one another, and then one is more than 10 times greater than the next, closest one. But that's also where I bring in this use of management. So because something immediately seems like an outlier, does that mean that it is bad balance? Well, not necessarily. Let's say that that outlying damage variable is only outlying because that sword takes 5 to 10 times longer to swing than the one that deals 90 damage. Well, now it sort of checks out, because even though if you're doing it, by ratio, if something with 1,000 damage takes 5 times the time to swing as something with 90, it's still coming out to about, 200 damage per instant, 1,000 over 5. It's still more. But there's the added risk of that it's taking you 5 times longer to swing it. And so your opportunities to swing it may be far rarer than the sword that swings 5 times faster and deals 90 damage. And so what seems like an outlier at first is actually pretty, is pretty well balanced. Now there's the question of why should we balance things? Well, if you want to have a good game, you want to have a lot of happy players. And it's impossible to make everybody happy, but generally speaking, what you should be doing is making sure that every intended play style in your game is about as good as one another. There's no such thing as perfect balance, which I'll get into later. Like, it's never going to be that each play style is identical in power to each other. You can never, and not only never, you shouldn't make it that if you have a guy with a sword and a guy with an axe, that they're going to have the exact same play style. In fact, I would say that's bad design and bad balance, but you want them to be close enough. You don't want the guy who's holding an axe to look at the guy who's holding a sword and go like, why is everything so easy for that guy? Why does that guy just like clear out the game and just, he just destroys it, and I just feel like I can't do anything. And this is, of course, assuming that both players are of equal skill level. There's also something to consider with balance. And now there's the question of how to balance, which is a harder question to answer because there's a lot of information that you need first. So let's say, you got the sword and you got the axe guy again, and the sword guy's just clearing everything out like crazy. The axe guy can't keep up with him. He's just watching the sword guy play the same game on the next PC over, and he's like, what am I doing wrong? Like, I'm just, I'm frustrated. I don't like that I have to struggle so much with this game and this guy gets it easy. So how do you balance it? Well, you have to analyze why the sword's doing so much better. Maybe it hits too fast. Maybe the sword is too long. Maybe it deals too much damage. Maybe for whatever reason you accidentally made it that enemies are just really weak to swords and not weak to axes, like they secretly deal different damage types. There's so many different variables to consider when it comes to balancing. But ultimately, you have to experiment. You have to change up what the sword can do. And see, maybe you might have to raise up what the axe can do too. Because balancing isn't just about reducing things in power, it's about increasing things in power too. All according to your vision for your game. And now that brings us into the next section of intention versus implementation. So let's take a second to talk about difficulty. Let's say that your intention is to make your game difficult. Now let's look back at the sword and the axe guy. And actually, let's draw them on board because we're talking about them a lot. So here's the guy with an axe. And here's like this like cool cat dude. You know, he's got a sword. It's like a big sword. It's huge. All right, so there he is. So here are two people. I'm going to put a little wall between them so the guy with the axe doesn't hurt the cat, out of jealousy. Now let's say that we want our game to be hard. That is our intention. And so we implement certain things into the game to make it hard, you know. The bosses deal a lot of damage. Maybe the players don't have that much health. Could be that if the game has a dodge roll, like I discussed in the prior episode, that it's very tight timing. There's not a lot of frames where you're actually invincible during the dodge. So that's the intent. The intent is for it to be difficult, and those are some of the ways you could try to implement that difficulty. Now, in doing so, there was just an oversight in how the developer implemented the sword. And because they want the game to be difficult, and the sword is making it too easy, in that case, your intent would sort of encourage you to reduce the power of the sword. Now let's say instead that our intention is for the game to be, it's not too bad, it's just supposed to be a fun game. It's not supposed to be too difficult at all. You just turn your brain off, you just whack, 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 everything gets destroyed, and yada, yada. In that case, the sword might be just fine. Maybe the axe is the issue. Maybe the axe needs to be brought up in power because your intent is for the game to be easier. And so you implement a fix, you raise up the damage of the axe, and then both these guys are really happy. And they're having, a good old time. And another thing about intention versus implementation is you sort of have to communicate your intent to the player. Because that also drives how the player responds to things. Now, let's say that you're playing a Souls game, which I said before I'm going to bring up a lot. When you're playing a Souls game, you know that the intent of the game is to have some kind of difficulty. You know that that's the developer's intention. And so when you come in and everything feels too easy, you might feel that something's wrong. Even if you're playing a game that says it's inspired by the Souls series, like so-called Souls-likes, if you go into one of those and it's too easy, the player might be frustrated because it was communicated to them by the genre of the game that they were going to be challenged. Now, what other types of communication are there? Sometimes you just communicate things via specific mechanics in your game. So I want to talk about a little game I was playing recently that was called Shape of Dreams. It's like a top-down sort of ARPG game. You can play co-op. Honestly, I had a really good time with it. I was playing with some of my friends, my partner, all that. But there was something in the game that struck me as being strangely balanced. So sorry, axe guy, you gotta go. We're keeping the cat though. The cat can stay. Or the definition's gone for now too. You can rewind if you got to look at it again. So here's our cat again. You know, he's playing Shape of Dreams now. And in Shape of Dreams, you progress across sort of this little map. Like, you know, you start here, and then you can choose where to go on the map. And your sort of objective is to find the boss at the end. The creature is returned. And now you can decide how you go about... Let's actually make a few more connections here. Okay, that's better. Now you can decide how you go about this map. And the map itself is fine. I had no issues with it. But on this map, there were these occasional icons. This isn't exactly what they looked like. But there were these little icons that would show up. And so if you decided, like, okay, that's a plus, not a cross, by the way. There's these little icons that show up. So let's say you hop on over here. So, you know, cat guy's coming in here. He's walking on in. He's arrived. And he's greeted with... I want green for this. He's greeted with this sort of like shrine. And, you know, you can interact with the shrine, and if you interact with the shrine, it heals you. It heals you like half or so health. It's like, woo! But it costs money in the game to do it. In-game money, not actual money. That would be funny. But either way, it costs you currency in the game to use this healing shrine. Now, that communicates a certain thing to me. The fact that, one, they're marked on the map, and two, that they cost money to use, it communicates to me and possibly other players that healing is a luxury. It's something that you have to make a conscious effort to come across on the map and use, and pay to use it. Maybe you're not supposed to be healing a bit too much. Maybe damage is supposed to stick to you more. But whatever the case, it implies to me that, you know, these things are pretty important. They're important enough to come on the map. Now, herein lies the issue, is that there are items that you can find in Shape of Dreams that you can equip to your skills. So let's say you have your little skill here. It's called bop. You know, you bop them. That's the skill. It's got a cooldown of, let's say, 2, 3, let's say 3 seconds. 3-second cooldown. So you can only use this move every 3 seconds. Now, in Shape of Dreams, you have these little kind of gems you can find, which you can equip onto a skill. And there is this one gem. I believe it is colored orange. This gem is called Clemency. And it's very pretty. It's a very pretty, like, nice orange gem. So we're just going to socket it in there. And what Clemency does is it heals you for a percentage of the damage of the move that you're using. Now, this is a game where you deal a lot of damage. And you can use this move every 3 seconds. Honestly, it usually gets more egregious than that. It usually turns into like every 1 or 2 seconds. But whatever the case, it gets to the point where you're just using this skill and your health fully heals. And it's not too difficult to get this thing either. And it's not too difficult to get to the point where your damage is so much that every single time you use your skill, you get fully healed by Clemency. And so why is that an issue? It's an issue because through the design of the game, through these little, you know, funny green shrines that we can find, it's been communicated to me that healing is supposed to be a luxury. It's not supposed to be something that I can do all the time. And this isn't even the most egregious use case of this thing, but I'm not here to rant completely about Shape of Dreams, because again, you know, I mostly like the game, but this was something that definitely rubbed me the wrong way. The question is then, what do you do? What do you do to fix it? Because you have one thing communicating that healing is supposed to be something that's rare, something that's a luxury. And then you have another thing in the game communicating that you're supposed to be healing all the time. Your health can just be going from like 10% to full and 10% to full, in like an instant. And it basically removes any worry of having to find these things ever on the map, especially once you're later in the game, because they don't matter. They don't matter. You're basically always going to be at full health if you're in combat, if you have any reliable way to heal. And so it just takes this mechanic of these healing things and just removes it. So that's one example of sort of questionable balance. And the way to fix it, well, there's numerous different ways, but obviously, we don't really want to get rid of this mechanic, these little Healy totem guys. They were put in the game for a reason. So the mechanic may be to just analyze outliers in your healing system, such as this Clemency gem, and just think, well, how much do I really want players to be healing? How reliable should healing be? Should there be a cooldown on healing? How many times should a player be healing, in one stage? And maybe you just adjust it down to the point where damage sticks more and you actually need these shrines to heal up, and so the player has to, actively avoid damage more. But in the event that they get hit, they have these shrines on the map as intended. And that could require other adjustments in your game. Maybe too much damage is unavoidable, and so it makes it so that stuff like Clemency feels mandatory. That's another thing you have to consider. There's a lot of different things to manage, and the more mechanics and systems you have in a game, the more you have to sort of figure out what adjusting the outliers will do. Like, what are the ramifications for adjusting certain outliers, and how much does it change the overall vision of your game? So we're going to go on to the next example of an outlying mechanic here. So there's a game that I used to play that a lot of people, I'm sure, are familiar with, and hopefully I won't trigger too much PTSD when I say the word. So I'm going to talk about a little game called League of Legends. Now, if you don't know much about League of Legends, I'll give you a quick rundown. I don't want to bog you down too much with the details, but essentially, you're on a map. There are these 3 lanes on the map, and there are these things at the end of the lanes in your little base called a nexus, and your goal is to blow the enemy nexus up. That's how you win. However, there are obstacles that are in your way. In each of the lanes, there's these little towers that block your passage. And until you destroy a tower, you can't progress further in the lane. Like, you can't just go straight to the enemy nexus. You gotta destroy this tower, then you gotta destroy this tower, and then you gotta destroy this tower. And there's a couple more right at the entrance to the base too, and you got these in here. Either way, you gotta destroy all of them before you can actually destroy the enemy nexus. And these towers are very protective. When you're under one, you're supposed to be pretty safe. So we got, our cat guy, he's playing League of Legends now, my condolences. And he's under his tower. He's having a rough lane. So you got your tower here. And your tower basically has like a laser beam that it can, aim at enemies. And it deals a lot of damage. Quite a lot of damage. And if you damage our friendly cat friend here, the laser will automatically target you. So let's say, you got one guy, he's coming in, he's like, I'm going to get you. And he whacks the cat. This laser's going to hit him, and he's going to explode. And so for the longest time, this communicated to the player that being under your tower is pretty safe. At least when you're in a 1 versus 1 scenario. And then there was an incident in which there was a playable character in the game known as Akali. And she used to be pretty fine. She was in the game for a long time. She had like little scythes. You know, she was like a little, you know, cool ninja lady. Got a collie here. This is her. And they decided one day that they were going to remake a collie. Now, their intent was to make her a very strong assassin-type character. And the way they implemented this was possibly one of the worst balanced design decisions that I have ever seen in a video game. So Akali, in her original design, she had this move that gave her, I probably shouldn't use green for this, we'll use blue. It gave her like this kind of shroud around her. And the shroud made it so that she was invisible. You know, when she went into the shroud, you couldn't see her anymore. It was like, oh, where'd she go? But towers have this thing called true sight. So that if you get into the range of a tower and you are invisible, it doesn't matter anymore. And our little cat guy can see you. He's like, oh, there they are. They're trying to get under the tower to get me. And then, of course, you know, if you hit somebody under the tower's gonna, you know, it's gonna blast you. Doesn't matter if you are invisible or not. So the person who did the redesign had an idea that they should add a new mechanic that was actually stronger than invisibility. It was called Obscure. And what did Obscure do? Obscure said that basically towers can't see you. Now, there's a lot of communication gone wrong here. Wherein it's been communicated to the player time and time again through design that if you're in a 1v1 and you're underneath your tower, you're pretty safe. And it's also been communicated to the player that if somebody is invisible and they come under your tower, that you can see them now. But there's now this mechanic called Obscure, which says that this tower can't see you anymore. And now, granted, it did keep you in a sort of small area of smoke. Like there was a limited amount of room you could move around, but it was honestly, you know, about half the radius of this sight of the tower anyway, so it really didn't matter. So Akali would, you know, she'd just walk up to you, and once again, she, you know, you'd be confused because she throws down her little shroud and she's invisible now, even though she's under your tower. And if she were to hit you while she was obscured, it would reveal her for a tiny amount of time. So tiny, in fact, that the tower could not fully aim and blast her before she went out of the tower's vision again. And so essentially what Akali would do is she would walk up to you under your tower and she would put down her stealth cloud and she would destroy you, and your tower couldn't help. This whole assumption that's been communicated, and it's assumed because it's been communicated, and it seems like the intent of this mechanic of the tower is that it's not that easy to, you know, destroy someone 1 versus 1 under a tower, but Akali could just do it. And there was huge backlash to this. Obviously, everybody who was playing Akali at the time loved it. They were like, oh, this is great. I can just win for free. But there was huge backlash, and eventually they decided, well, you know what? Obscure's not a good idea. Obscure's not a good idea. And so they allowed it so that if Akali used her stealth under the tower, that the tower could still see her. And she's still pretty good, but it's not to the point where she could just walk up to you, plop down that smoke bomb, and you basically lost. So that sort of leads into player feedback. So through player feedback, enough players were able to voice that Akali was not particularly fun to play against. That in fact, they kind of felt like they couldn't do anything. and that any time they were against her, it was basically a free loss for them and a free win for her. So, the company in charge of League of Legends, Riot Game, removed the obscure mechanic. Now, feedback's not always that simple. And there's a lot of different ways to take feedback. And feedback to when Akali had that obscure mechanic was mostly saying the same thing, but some of it was saying it, a bit harsh, a bit threateningly. Generally speaking, I would say if you're providing feedback, please don't threaten devs. Sometimes people make mistakes. Sometimes people have good intentions that are implemented badly. And, it got fixed, such is life. So let's talk about feedback and how to give it. Now, feedback is essentially just finding something in a game that you have some sort of opinion on and going to the developer and saying, hey, I'm not really sure if this is supposed to be this strong, or I'm not really sure if this is supposed to be this weak. Or just outright saying, like, this is too strong, this is too weak, which is not good feedback, which I'll get into soon, for a couple of reasons. So when you're giving feedback, there are a few things you have to consider. What is the developer's vision of the game? We're going back to like difficulty intention. Did the developer intend for this to be difficult? Did they intend for this to be easy? And these are things you can figure out by just, if the developer has design documents that they've uploaded somewhere, you can look through those. If it's a developer that's fine with, just socializing with people on like a Discord or Reddit or whatever, you can just ask them there. And once you have your answer, once you sort of understand their vision, then you can give the feedback of, well, if your intention is for the game to be challenging, I feel like this specific mechanic or this item just makes the game too easy. Now, for example, this cat's sword, it's too long. It's just too long. And you feel like with the way that the game is structured, that there wasn't meant to be a weapon that's this long. And the developer might go, you know what, you're right, it doesn't really align with how I want the game to be. Maybe we're gonna make the weapon, we're gonna just shave off the top there. We're gonna make it a little less big, and we're gonna see what happens from there. Maybe that's all that's needed. Maybe this, that's all good. Now everything's, sunshine and daisies. Or the developer might just say, well, I want this sword to be that long. Maybe it kind of goes against my vision of difficulty, but this weapon is intended to do this. It's intended to be a sword that's, it's just long. It's just a long sword. That's just how it is. And if that happens, the correct thing to do is to say, okay, all right. Fair enough. Because ultimately, it's the developer's video game. And as much as you might think that something goes against their vision, or you might think that something is too overpowered or too underpowered, you have to accept that they're the ones that are making the game, and ultimately, that your opinion on something does not necessarily outdo what they want in their game. And some developers, that can end up working against them. I've definitely worked with some developers who are very, very stubborn and would keep things in their game even to the detriment of like a bunch of players, the things that a bunch of testers didn't agree with, and then it would go live, and then a bunch more players didn't like it, and then it would, stubbornness isn't always good, but stubbornness is sometimes good. Sometimes a developer simply knows better than the player what they want their game to be. And, sometimes you got to stick to your guns. But now that gets into the sort of give and take discussion of, let's say, like, you know, a player gave you feedback and you're not really sure about it. So you start, you know, you measure your options. You start getting into the, well, what do I want to give or take from the players? Now, again, this sword is a long sword, but let's say that only one person really comes to the developer and gives the feedback that, oh, the sword's too long. Let's say there's 99 other people that, you know, the developer puts up a poll and they're like, do you think this sword's too long? And 99 out of the 100 people are like, no, the sword's fine. Well, in that case, you probably don't want to take away from the 99 players to satisfy the one. Now, if it's 50-50, that's different. Then you have to, you know, you sort of weigh like, well, do I want to irritate these 50 players and then they're less happy about the game, but these 50 players end up happier about the game? Or do you want to go the other way around and these 50 are happier about the game and these 50 are less happy about it? And that ultimately comes down to developer discretion. You have to decide what are the situations where giving or taking something from the player will increase player happiness the most. Because maybe if you remove some length from this long sword, you know, those 50 people who thought the sword length was okay, they'll be irritated at first, but then they might get used to it. And they might end up even realizing like, oh, you know what? Yeah, it was strong. I liked using it. It was a really long sword, but it's better for the game if it's a shorter sword. Or perhaps you side with the players who think that it's completely fine and don't want anything changed, and the 50 players who weren't happy with the long sword go like, yeah, you know, maybe it wasn't as strong as I thought it was. I'm going to test it out some more. You know, actually, maybe it's okay. Or maybe it is still busted and you just decide, hey, you know, I don't want to change it. And then there is the question of giving to players. So I would say that generally players prefer imbalance when you give something to them rather than take something from them. And this can often be seen, I think the most recent example was the game Silk Song came out. It was, you know, it was like 7 years in the making and everybody was very excited. And then a bunch of people played it. And a lot of people thought it was, you know, a bit too hard. And even me as somebody who played it, and I enjoyed it for the most part, yeah, I thought it wasn't too bad. But there were definitely some decisions in it where I thought, like, I don't know about that. That's a little bit too punishing. Like, this is just sort of, it was more annoying than it was hard. And a lot of people gave similar feedback. The annoying thing in this case being that there was sort of this trap you could fall into, and most traps in the game only dealt 1 damage, and this trap dealt 2 damage. And at the part of the game where it was at, with the skills that the player had, it was very difficult to not fall into these traps. And so you would just lose and lose and lose and lose and lose, and it was very frustrating. So the developers went, you know what, we're gonna give you this one. We're going to say, all right, we're going to lower the damage of these things. And this is both a give and a take, because you're giving to the player an easier experience, but you're also taking difficulty from the game. And there are other types of sort of give and take trades that can happen wholly to the game or wholly to the player. Now, for example, let's go back to our big long sword here, and let's think of an example of giving and taking at the same time. So let's say that we agree that the sword is just way too long. We have to take away, gotta take it away. It's too long. This is the sword now. But we decide, you know, well, we don't want to remove that much power, but the sword just can't be this long. So we decide that along with taking the length of the sword, we're going to give the fact that now it sets things on fire. It deals a little extra damage when it hits things with like some nice burn effect, and maybe there are enemies that are weak to fire damage. And for the players, they might be like, oh my god, I can't believe that they removed the length from the sword, but then they get into the game and they see that the sword is on fire now, and they go, ooh, okay, I can deal with that. I lost a little bit. It's on fire now. That's pretty cool. And this is honestly my preferred way to balance. You can't just wholly take things from a player unless it's just so much of an outlier that really the only way to realistically balance it is to just nuke some variable from orbit. I want to give an example of a game that I did testing for, in which I'm now luckily allowed to talk about the testing I did for it. It was this game called Estrella Six-Sided Oracles. It's like sort of, if you're familiar with like deck building games where you put a bunch of cards in a deck and then you draw them and it determines what moves you can use in combat. It was like that, but there were dice. That has absolutely nothing to do with the mechanic that I'm about to discuss. A little summary of the game. The mechanic was that there was this kind of squiddy guy, this squiddy playable character, kind of Cthulhu-esque. And he had this unique status effect that he could have, which was called Astrium. And it could stack up to 10. And when it stacked up to 10, it could be 0 through 10. And when it stacked up to 10, he sort of had this explosion go about him. And he would lose all of his Astrium. And every enemy over here would take 6 damage. That was the mechanic. Now, he had this move that said that if his Astrium count was 9 and his dice landed on a certain face, then he could deal somewhere in the realm of like 40 damage. So that's a pretty big number, especially when we're dealing with values like 6 before. And the issue was that this move had no downside. As long as you were at 9 Astrium, you could just land on that. And it was a very reliable dice, so it was pretty hard for it to not land on the high damage amount. So essentially, if one was in your hand, somebody was going to explode. And the issue was that if you had enough of these in your deck, and you had a reliable way to get 9 Astrium, the game was just over. And it was a little too easy to do. I talked with the developer about it. I said, this is just too easy. And they were like, oh, well, maybe we can make it that it just reduces the Astrium when you cast it. Maybe your Astrium goes down to like 5, and then you have to get it back up to 9. And I just think like, it's pretty easy to go back from 5 to 9, just with how the game is set up now and how you can gain Astrium. And also, that would just kind of feel bad. It would be a kind of, bad adjustment. So what I recommended was that when you use this move and you're at 9 Astrium, it ticks you up to 10. And now because it ticks you up to 10, it resets back to 0, but it does that little explosion that then deals the 6 damage to the enemies. And now at face value, that is a massive reduction in power, because you can no longer, keep using this thing that deals 40 damage. Theoretically, if you had 2 of them, you could, deal 40 to this guy and 40 to this guy. And now instead you're using one, dealing 46 to one and 6 to the other. And then you have to get the 0 all the way back up to 9. But the reason why, and this was still in the testing phase, so, there weren't a bunch of people dealing with the nerf. The reason why myself and the other testers came to end up enjoying this change was because it felt better. It felt better because not only were you, dealing 40 damage to one guy, but then there was this burst of energy from your character that would deal damage to everything. And so even though it was a pretty huge reduction in power, it was sold to the player in a way that just felt good. And sometimes that's part of give and take too, is that sometimes you take away power, but you give satisfaction. You give the satisfaction that, oh, well, you know, I took away the power from this thing, but now when you do that thing, it feels better to do it. And you can, this is like one of the cases where actually I do think that, you know, visual effects and sound effects can sort of lend to the sauce more than the mechanics and variables, because things feeling good has a lot to do with visuals and sound. But even if you didn't have the visuals and sound, it still feels better for the player to combine two sort of mechanics. They're combining the mechanic of being at Astrium 9 and being able to use that move with the mechanic of going to Astrium 10 and then doing an explosion. So from the player's perspective, it's like, yeah, the power went down a lot, but now I'm like doing two things at once. So that's one good example from my personal experience. Also, shout out to Leo if you're watching this. You're a great dev. I loved working with you. And so now let's think about give and take from the opposing perspective, like the perspective of an enemy. Like, let's say, you know, you got this boss. He's like Trumpet B. That's his name. His name is Trumpet B. People are a little irritated with Trumpet B. You know, they're like, he moves too fast. Like, he's a speedy guy. He's like, you know, he's just flying at you. You don't really have any real good opportunity to hit him. And the developer goes like, Trumpet B is a little too fast, but I still want this encounter to be kind of challenging. So they just do, you know, a simple give and take, where the take is that they take away Trumpet B's speed. He's a little less speedy now. He's about this speedy. That's how long his speed lines are. But they decide that Trumpet B deals more damage now. Or maybe it's something more complex than that. Maybe Trumpet B has some new bullet move that they can shoot out. So even though they're less speedy now and you have more of an opportunity to approach them, there's still the risk of getting hit by these little bullets. And so you maintain a level of difficulty that you want in the fight, but you make the fight more approachable and less frustrating to the player. Now the player's like, oh, this thing's not zipping around everywhere. I can actually hit it. But it's like, oh, you know, when I get hit, I take more damage. But it feels like overall a more balanced and fair fight, even though there was a give and take, and maybe the win rate against that boss could end up being the exact same percentage it was before. The exact same amount of players might beat that boss now as they did when it was super fast, but it feels better. And of course, feeling is subjective. But you can get an idea of how good a feeling is by how your players react to it. If you do a good give and take, then your player feedback's going to improve. And that's generally the sign that even though it's subjective, you improve the balance on your game. It's not always the case. And one last thing I want to bring up about the give and take is you got to be careful when you're doing it. And especially because when it comes to taking away, because players really like the power level that they've gotten used to. So if you have 100 players and 10 of them are playing something that you've decided is a massive balance outlier, it's just way too strong. If you take that away, those 10 players are going to be pretty mad. Even if you do a pretty good give with that take, even if the flaming sword is really cool, some players might just be mad that this sword's just not as long anymore. So that's something to also keep in mind, and that is also why doing testing phases, internal testing, and maybe not as much early access. I don't know how I feel about the early access trend, but like an alpha test, a beta test with like dedicated game testers and dedicated QAs, whether they're volunteers or not, that really helps out, because QAs and internal testers, or if you want to be a QA or internal tester, take this advice. Your job is to help the developers reach their vision. It's not necessarily for you to make something really powerful and have crazy fun and all this, if it's at the expense of the game's overall balance. In fact, your job is more so to be like, well, this thing's cool, but I think it really exceeds the developer's visions for the game. You know, I should communicate that to the developer, and maybe it gets changed, maybe it doesn't. But you don't want that to go live, because there's a difference between 10 people testing a game and 2 people getting kind of upset that something got adjusted and the other 8 being happy, or having like 20,000 people playing a game and all of a sudden you're irritating thousands of people when you take something from them. So I'm going to finish up here with a couple brief segments. One is PvE versus PvP balance. Now I'm going to bring up a statement that's been said to me many times, which is a funny statement, which is you don't need to balance a PvE game. That is a very wrong statement. If you do not balance a PvE game, you're going to end up... PvE, by the way, means player versus environment, if you didn't know that. It's generally, you know, a single-player game or a cooperative game that's against enemies. You're not going against the people you're playing against, or you're playing the game alone. That is player versus environment. And some people say the balance of those things don't, you know, it doesn't matter. It's just like, you know, you're just playing the game yourself. Why does it matter if this thing's strong? Just don't use it, is usually the, the statement that I hear. But again, you have to remember there's a vision to a game. There's an intention to the design of a game. And even if something is player versus environment, if you're a developer and you really feel like something's outside the scope of your vision, you might just need to, you know, try and change it. And players might be really irritated at first. They might say, why are you trying to, you know, change a player versus environment game? But there are a lot of players who are also going to be happy, because they're going to feel like, oh, well, now the way I'm playing the game feels more in line with the way those guys are playing the game. Or there are also a bunch of people that when they sort of realize that something is really too strong, they purposely avoid it because they don't want the game to become too easy to them. So if anything, in reducing the power of a certain aspect of your game, you might attract more players to use that aspect of it. And if I'm being honest with you, when it comes to balance, if there's players that they're only using the best things over and over and over again, they're usually going to get pretty burnt out anyway, because it's kind of tiresome to do the same thing over and over. And the trade-off of those players sort of being a little irritated and possibly not playing the game anymore, the trade-off of that for the rest of your community being happy and more of them being attracted to that play style and saying like, oh, you know, the balance in this game is so much better, that's a big thing, because a lot of people I've noticed, especially when you go into reviews of games, the perception of balance is huge. And even if there's a few players that are really using that overpowered thing in your game, that imbalanced thing, and they think it's really fun, there are probably just as many players going and reviewing your game and reviewing it negatively because they're saying like, I can't believe this is in the game, it's just so unfun, it makes everything so easy, yada yada. So balance is always important. But the issues that I just described are exacerbated in a player versus player or PvP game. Because in a player versus player game, if something is significantly better than other things, for example, the Akali Obscure that I brought up earlier, a lot of players are going to get frustrated. Or a bunch of players are just going to flock to that thing that's really strong. But maybe you're in a situation or a type of game like in League of Legends, everybody can't pick Akali. I mean, there are some game modes where you can do that. But for the most part, everybody can't pick Akali. So now you have, you know, all the players on Akali's team who might be frustrated that they didn't get to pick the really ridiculously strong thing. And then the 5 players on the other team who are just like, oh, I really don't want to deal with Akali right now. So, you know, the issue is exacerbated there. And that is also partly why player versus player balance is very difficult, and why it's It's often a thing which is just so constantly changing, especially in live service games like League of Legends. When it comes to balance, whether PvE or PvP, you have sort of the objective versus the subjective. Now, the objective would be something like Akali's Shroud used to ignore turret vision. That's objective. That's a thing it used to do. That was a thing you could observe and see with your eyes, although the tower couldn't see it. The subjective is that it's not fun to play against. People don't like playing against it. And in that case, I would say the subjective feeling was generally right. It was not very fun. It took a bunch of the intentions and expectations of the game and just threw them out the window and gave a massive power imbalance to whoever was playing Akali versus their opponent. But sometimes the subjective is harder to analyze. Now, let's say that you have a character in a player versus player game. In a game like League of Legends, you pick different characters, everybody goes against each other, and that character has a 49.5% win rate. So pretty even, a little below average, very slightly below. But everyone seems to insist that this character is not fun to play against. Well, that could be confusing, because objectively speaking, you're looking at the, the win rate of this character, and it's below average. So how could they not be fun to play against? Like, what's going on there? Well, again, fun, and the fun you have engaging with something is fully subjective. In the same way that a player could be using something in a game that's incredibly overpowered and a huge power outlier, and they think it sucks. Like, they just think it's awful. Now, that's another subjective thing. But it comes to the question of, how do you deal with that when it comes to balance? How do you measure the overall fun of your player base? And not only that, but how do you figure out where the fun or the lack of fun is stemming from? There's so many variables and mechanics and systems in every single game that it could be any combination of any of them that are determining this subjective fun meter. So, you can't just go into your game and change the fun variable. Actually, I think you could do that in Undertale, but that's that's a different thing. You cannot change the subjective value of fun by just going into your game and changing something and it's guaranteed to be changed. Whether it's a PvP game, whether it's a PvE game. And when it comes to PvP, this subjectivity thing is huge, which is why I'm sure if you went onto the League of Legends forums right now, actually they might have gotten rid of the forums. Let's just say the Reddit or the Discord or whatever, you're going to see so many different opinions about so many different things that it is absolutely impossible to keep track of everything and create a subjective experience in which everybody is having fun, which is sort of the plight of balancing PvP games. I do honestly think it's easier to balance PvE games, which is why it's funny to me when people say you shouldn't balance them. But you might end up in a similar situation where there's just so many different opinions about different things that it's impossible for you to really get a read on how to best balance the game. And in that case, you just gotta follow your vision. Again, even if people are saying you shouldn't balance a game or that this way of balancing a game is bad, ultimately, you should be following your vision for what the game is, taking feedback from players to sort of implement it into the vision, adjusting things where you can, and coming to this compromise as best you can where it seems like you're happy with the product you made and the players are happy with the product you're giving them. Now, the very last thing I want to talk about here is the meta. So meta, or metagaming, is generally the Perceived, importance on perceived, the perceived best way to play a video game. Sometimes it's more objective than subjective. For example, I would say, returning back to the Shape of Dreams example, most people who play Shape of Dreams agree that clemency is really good. People might not necessarily think the healing is overpowered, and yet most people who play the game, myself included, tend to really want to find a clemency when they're playing the game because it makes it far easier to win. Sometimes, you know, players might put rules on themselves where they're not allowed to use it because it makes it too easy to win. But whatever the case, that is the meta in that game. The meta is to find and use clemency. And after a while, when you're playing the game and you're just doing the same thing over and over again, or if it's a PvP game and you're playing against a collie over and over again, you get fatigued. You start to feel like, you know, you're just running around in circles. What's even the point of playing the game? I'm just doing the same thing over and over again, or I'm just playing against the same thing over and over again, and I can't win. And this cycles back to the importance of balance. In that, first off, I want to say you can never avoid a meta. Players are always going to look for the absolute best thing to play. There are so many game servers that I'm in where somebody will come in and they've never touched the game before in their entire life, and they'll say, what's the best thing I can play? What's the best weapon? What's the best build? Is there a guide that I can read for the game? You know, they just want to come in, they want to blow the game away as easily as possible and then move on with their day. It's unavoidable. But it is up to the developers and also the players to some degree to help create a landscape in which the meta is not too far above everything else. And where the game feels good no matter how you play it, and the average player isn't just defaulting to the same thing over and over again. There's a statement I've heard that players will optimize the fun out of every game in pursuit of finding a meta. But what good balance is making it so that it's as hard to find that meta as possible. Because when you take all the opinions and all the ideas about a pretty well-balanced game, you'll have groups of people that say this thing's the meta, or groups of people that say this thing's the meta. There's no clear option. And maybe there is one option that is actually better than everything else. But not so much so that everybody wants to do it. So that's the end of this video. I hope that, you know, you learned something from it. We're going to keep this guy on the board a little longer with his, you know, his short flaming sword. He's been through a lot in this episode, so we're just going to let him relax for a little bit. If you have any questions or comments, you know, you can leave them down below. I'll make sure to read those. And yeah, I'll see you in the next episode. If there are also any specific topics or games that you want me to cover, just let me know. Yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.